This is To the Right House, a new podcast series by the Global Campus of Human Rights. From skepticism to hope, from utopia to empathy, we discuss human rights, riding waves, but also signalling where the light is. This podcast was recorded in Venice, Italy, on the island of Lido, at the Global Campus headquarters.
Hello, and once again welcome to the Global Campus series on engaging with human rights skepticism. Our focus today will be on culture and religion-based skepticism. To explore this important topic, I'm joined by two exceptionally well-qualified human rights experts. Mr. Gerald Joseph is a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia since 2016 and currently serves as vice chairperson of the commission. He has been active for more than 30 years as a human rights defender and trainer, both at national and international level. Mr. Gerald also holds a master's degree in human rights from Mahidol University, which is one of the Global Campus participating universities. Professor Nandini Ramanujam is co-director and director of programs of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism at McGill University, Faculty of Law in Montreal, Canada. Her research interests include, among many other topics, law and development, economic justice, and the role of civil society and the media in the promotion of rule of law. She has also extensive experience in working with human rights in the ex-Soviet political space and elsewhere around the world. I am George Ulrich, Academic Director of the Global Campus of Human Rights and host of the present podcast series. To introduce today's topic, value-based skepticism is undoubtedly the most prevalent and familiar form of human rights skepticism. It's characterized by a critical assessment of human rights from the perspective of culture and/or religion. This can be stated with reference to specific human rights standards that are seen to collide with accepted cultural norms, or it can target the very idea of universal human rights as an authoritative global value. Often, such critiques are linked with the perception that human rights express Western individualistic values that are being imposed on the rest of the world in an unwelcome fashion. In theoretical terms, such skeptical perspectives tend to be linked with the theory of cultural relativism. These are issues that have been extensively discussed by human rights scholars and advocates, but they're by no means definitively settled. Confronting cultural and religious skepticism is part and parcel of human rights work on the ground, as well as in high diplomatic circles. They require innovative and constructive responses. My question to you both is, how do issues of this nature come up in your own work, whether it's in education or as working with the Human Rights Commission, and how do you address them? Maybe I could ask you, Nandini, to take a lead.
Thank you very much, George, and I look forward to this conversation. So I'll start by paraphrasing one of the greatest points Amartya Sen has made, is that not only there are differences on the subject of freedoms and right that actually exist between different societies, that is often exaggerated, but also there's typically little note taken of substantial variations within each local culture. So we tend to exaggerate differences between societies, but there is immense plurality on values and contestations around these values within cultures. No culture is a monolith. And through these contestations is what social and cultural norms are nudged, and they are being nudged. Having said that, I will come to the question of the universal human rights framework, which in my view is under scrutiny. And it is under scrutiny from top down by demagogues and populists and politicians, but it is under scrutiny and is being challenged by 5.1 billion people. And that is the number comes from World Justice Project report about people who lack access to justice. That is a staggering number. And the Human Rights Project, the Universal Project, has somehow failed a vast swathe of humanity. And these 5 billion, the report organizes them around three categories, but 4.1 billion people live outside the protection of law. And they do not enjoy rights, de jure guarantees of rights at all. And in my view, I think these people, and in my work, the way I look at it is, I don't think these billions of people are challenging the human rights paradigm based on clash of culture, or it is Western value which is being challenged. It is that it has not included them in the advancement of rights. Their goal for dignity and justice is not being answered by this universal paradigm. So I'll ask Gerald whether he agrees with me and what he thinks, his perspectives from Malaysia and other part of the world.
Thank you, Nandini, and good to be here with George and for this conversation. When I look at this topic, and I think the word universal sounds so beautiful, but we always get attacked when we do human rights work for being part of this universal human rights framework. It's a little bit illogical for something that is supposed to go across the planet is seen as a negative. And then you realize this is then thrown in with, and this is a Malaysian experience, as far as just yesterday, a minister made a statement saying that Human Rights Commission, we will support and work with you, but don't forget that universal human rights must come in tandem with a Malaysian mold. So then you're wondering, what is this that he's speaking about? Then I realized that whenever they use this Western values and try to dismantle this universal, I use the word so-called universal human rights value, and I'll explain later why I use that so-called, is because the framework of human rights actually has, it resides in equalizing power of that 5.1 billion Nandini that you spoke about. It's actually giving power to people to say that I have that equal worth of dignity, that equal worth of rights like you on the top, and what about me? So this what about me question, it looks great on paper for us, and it's actually the correct framework for anyone to say that I'm as human as you, but it disrupts the power at the top, because the political holders would then say, the more people have rights, the more they know about rights, the more they would demand to share in that power base. And I think that's why we always get attacked for promoting or protecting human rights, because it's actually getting into that space where they feel that politicians or political power holders feel, now I cannot have a free run, because even the poorest of the poor, the smallest village community will have a say, and they will feel unhappy with me because now they have a clearer understanding that they have that equal claim to rights as I am. And that's why when in my experience of, I've got some experience to be invited to run some training on the ground with communities. And I don't start in my human rights training with, say, the slum community of Nairobi, or the indigenous in Malaysia, or the caste-based communities or discriminated caste-based communities, the Dalits in India. I never start with what is universal human rights. I start the conversation of what you think you have and you don't have. And then that conversation inevitably leads to them saying, I have a right to equality. I have a right to this land. I have a right to a housing. Then you realize, this rights has been universalized not by the UN, but by people on the ground. That's why I got more and more convinced that the universal human rights framework is a people on the grounds framework to understand them being kept out as human beings with dignity. So, Nandini, I'm very much in line with what you said, but I think that power base is disrupted by those on top because of human rights. Over to you.
Yeah. So, I think no matter where, I think your work on the ground and wherever I've worked, no matter where people live, they want to live a life of dignity. They want to seek justice, and they want to live with freedom. And freedom is manifested differently in different societies. And this is where I think my work in law and development has brought me a great deal of insight. So just similar to human rights, universal human rights, law and development has swung from one extreme to the other, from absolute universalism, one size will fit all, to radical relativism, that each society has its own norms and own custom, and therefore, human rights will look very differently. And I think these extremes are not terribly helpful. I think there is immense lessons to be learned by middle-level generalization and how to operationalize the realization of human rights projects. And as you rightly say, that it is the people-centered. I think we've spent decades focused on the state and state alone. And this is not to say that state has to be ignored, but I think empowering individual agency. And that is where a lot of work is happening. And I have a few examples to share during our chat. And that is, I think, revolutionizing the way human rights paradigm is shifting. And as you say, people are demanding what's owed to them. And I think the most important work is to reinforce individual agency, enhance people's freedom so they can demand the rights they are owed.
Yes, I think the word individual agency is absolutely right, because when I speak to a person, I speak to a person. I don't speak to the person on behalf of his or her community or his or her history of where she or him were born. But the individual agency actually is not disconnected from that place I live. It's not saying that the place I live determines my individual agency, but my individual agency actually knows where I live. So it's not a disconnect. And usually when this word individual agency is used, automatically we say, you see, you're not an Asian or an African. The value system is, we Asian value, we love our community. I said, of course, I love my community, but that does not mean my community has forgotten that I'm a human person. A child is born into a family. The child is born in a poor house with no water, no rights, and that child needs to go to school. But I speak about it as my community. So I think Nandini is spot on to bring that point back to the fore. The conversation of individual agency actually is individuals living in the reality of where they come from. There's no disconnect, because I'm not going to be the fighter, say, I don't care with you, but I'm actually going to fight along other individuals, and this is my collective community.
Yeah. Could I maybe, this is very, very interesting to hear both of you, and I see a lot of consensus emerging in the discussion, which is nice, even if you come from slightly different points of view. If I hear you correctly, I think what you're both saying in various ways is that the idea of culture and cultural differences can be overstated. That's, at least it's not maybe the most useful starting point. The idea of cultural particularities can be instrumentalized by people in power to sort of disqualify human rights, and they can also, in some ways, be exaggerated in the sense that in reality, as you say, cultural norms are contested in reality, and they're fluid and they're dynamic and they undergo development, and they also adapt to people's current life situations. And I think, Nandini, what you started by reminding us is that there's a profound problem of exclusion and the disillusionment with being disempowered, excluded. And I think that's exactly, Gerald, where your ideas come in, that the human rights work on the ground, and as you do in your commission, needs to start with empowering individuals and communities, in a certain sense from the bottom up, both to demand political change and economic change, but also to be empowered to define one's own concepts of freedom and realizing human dignity. That doesn't have to fit one particular mold, as long as there's a conformity with certain very basic and very fundamental standards. Is that a reasonable way to summarize so far?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And could I maybe try then to throw a little bit of a wrench into the wheel, so to say, and ask, but how do we then deal with some of the real and remaining value clashes? So we have an international human rights law concept of harmful traditional practices, where there are certain practices that are culturally accepted, or at least enjoy a fairly widespread acceptance, and that nevertheless are deemed to be completely incompatible with minimal human rights protections. How do you address such conflicts?
The first part is that the constructive manner of discussion with people coming from different points of their life, or been taught or educated about the notions of human rights. And I say taught and educated is because I think there's so much of propaganda, political propaganda, against universalizing human rights and giving back that individual agency to the person to decide what's best for them or the community. But we still need to find a way to sit down and have that conversation. And in my work in the Human Rights Commission, so we meet different government agencies, from law enforcement, police, immigration, prison, to drug detention, and a mix of people. And one thing I find sometimes a little bit funny is that you can give the best of presentations on human rights, don't matter what right you want to talk about. Then when you ask, do you have a question, a hand will inevitably go up and ask you, is human rights giving people, LGBT people, the right to marry? And that's not Malaysian. So then you realize, hey, but I just spoke about 45 minutes on no to torture, or whatever other content. But in their mind, it's been framed that rights means it will take away something that we feel is good for us. In this instance, they have been taught that sexual identity and different sexual orientation is a no-no, because society, the majority, is not in favor. So in their mind, that's a harmful practice for society. So the conversation starts not by, of course, you can easily tell them, come on, man, you have a right, they have a right, but that's not the conversation. I have to flip it to ask, people are different. I mean, you and I were not born like that. Our sexual orientation is maybe different. But if someone in your midst, and I know you've seen them, you've met them, what do? Do we throw them out the window? Do we throw them in jail? We can't do that. They're human beings. And all religions, all culture appeals to our compassion to respect them. No torture, no violence, no discrimination. So the conversation moves from a human rights lens to a compassionate lens, but yet reiterates the rights language. And then there is a little bit more nods and understanding, because they're realizing that, okay, there is that conversation between rights, compassion, and respect for individuals who are different from you and me. So I said, I'm not asking you, I'm not promoting anything to the LGBT, because this is in the Malaysian context, but I'm telling you, how do we respect respond to people who are different from us. And then you get the nods, and then I can go on to my next question about whatever content I was doing. But I'm just flipping it, George, because they feel some of the rights are harmful to a larger society. And you flip it back to say that large or small, individuals are different. We cannot decide at a certain point of time. Thanks.
Yes, so, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, is one of the human rights conventions which has most reservations from the state parties, and state parties claiming that certain articles and do not align with their cultural and religious norms. So there is a higher level political conversation about clash of values. But I would still retain the claim that I think we have to flip this question from the point of view of people. And I'm going to talk about women. So no matter where women live, I think, again, going back to sin, the fundamental question is, what do they want to be? And what do they want to do? It's about functioning, valuing what they want to do in their context and who they want to be. Do they have freedom to make strategic decisions about their life? And when it comes to child marriage, when it comes to other so-called harmful practices, I think it is women's agency which needs to be enhanced. And globally speaking, no matter where we are talking, I think there is tremendously good work going on, led by women's civil society. So on intimate partner violence, it could be gender-based violence, economic empowerment of women, child marriage, female genital mutilation. I think women's civil society is leading norm nudging trend, and this is not once again, this clash of value is always positioned as somehow culture is primitive and it comes in clash with modernized ideas or progressive ideas. Culture it moves. It's a dynamic institution. It's a slow-moving institution when compared to political and legal institution, but it moves. It interacts with other technological change. It interacts with digital revolution in the world, and so there is that aspect. And to answer your question, George, I think one must go back to what Sally Engelmary talked about is translation and vernacularization of human rights. So top down, some abstracted ideas being sort of transposed or transplanted on diverse communities obviously doesn't work. But there are go-between. There are people who are able to translate these ideas. And they are civil society activists, they are advocates, they are women's organizations. And it's very interesting. Sally gives two examples of two NGOs working in Baroda, in the same city in Gujarat. One is an NGO with more resources and English-speaking staff. And the other is an NGO which is less well-resourced and much more connected to local community. And they both are championing women's rights, but they're doing it differently and they are focusing on different aspects of women's rights. So the one which is very local is looking at gender-based violence and working with communities which are women, marginalized and economically disempowered women. And the more urban approach is looking at the rights of LGBTQI. and working with women and championing their rights. So I think to conflate a culture as one, value as one, is, I think, it's not helpful. And even in the most traditional communities, in fact, I was saying that women and their aspirations, women, middle class, educated women may want exactly the same thing, whether they are living in Nairobi, Cairo, New Delhi, or in Kuala Lumpur. But within these countries, women who are in rural contexts with lower educational and economic outcome have different aspirations and different possibilities. So culture as such as a monolith and something which is backwards is, I think, not a helpful way to frame this value conflict conversation. So I don't buy into this East-West value conflict, from Huntington to anyone else. I think it's very simplistic.
No, it's very well taken, Nandini and Gerald. And I think one of the points I hear you now agreeing on very clearly, in addition to expanding and elaborating the importance of empowerment, and in view also of the idea of expanding capabilities, as you're talking about, Nandini, clearly, which for me too is a guiding philosophical idea, in fact, and comes from Amartya Sen, and it comes obviously also from Martha Nussbaum, who's very much elaborated this in a feminist perspective. But I think also, Gerald, what you were talking about, which was the slow transformation. The slow transformation of accepted norms and the sort of negotiating, the internal contestation and the negotiating of conflicting perspectives and ideas of what's acceptable and what is not, And I think in these transformational processes, I think the meeting between top-down and bottom-up approaches, so to say, is essential, because it can't be all done from the bottom, and it can't all be done by norms that are decreed from above. It has to be, and sometimes I think you have cultural leaders or opinion leaders who really make groundbreaking efforts. We're commemorating Archbishop Tutu in these weeks, who also took a lead in expanding the space of freedom in the South African context. For example, also by assimilating the conception of equality with regard to racial equality and the conception of equality with regard to various gender identities, And I think to make those links as a spiritual leader and opinion leader is essential, also in facilitating these cultural transformations. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. If I may add, George, what Nandini said, if I'm looking at how the conversation with the communities, yeah, you're right. I totally agree. It must start from the ground. I think very nicely said about translation and vernacularization. But also, if we want leaders to grow, to challenge the power hole at the top, because these two works hand in hand. And I'm remembering practices of, I was doing a training, I think, was it in Ghana, where it was all a regional training, and they were all human rights people. But then suddenly we came to this conversation on gender, and a very senior by age gentleman said that it was okay for women to have a role at home and the men to do this. He spoke not out of spite, but just he took it as norm, and that was, of course, big uproar. It was a human rights training. But then he was looking around very perplexed. And then I realized that internalization in our private sphere has not really happened, despite us holding the human rights flag, even in the most simplest way of sharing burdens at home. Then I remember in Malaysia, we are still struggling with that early child marriage still can be allowed through some special dispensation from the Islamic Religious Authority, because there's a special department there. And then those children lose out on that opportunity for full development, for education. And I call that harmful cultural practices. And we are working to try, and the government everyone is agreeing that every woman should have that opportunity. And the workforce in Malaysia is, more than 50% are women. The top leadership in corporate, I think it's gone up to 35%. So the climb is high. But I also remember the caste-based discrimination in India. I think Nandini gave an example of an organization. The violent practices of allowing the child to sit at the back row and missing out on the school education system, and violence when you try to partake in economic activity because of the separation according to caste. So I think that for me is as direct. You can get enough examples of harmful cultural practices that actually keep a whole 250 million people, because of their caste identity, out of that equality line. And so I think this is shocking. We are in this super modern world that can come up with a vaccine in less than a year, but yet there's no vaccine to equalize rights for all.
Absolutely, Gerald. And therefore, I think there is a very fine work by someone called Roland Gerard, which is about interaction between fast and slow-moving institutions in a society and what kind of changes it produces. And culture is a slow-moving institution, but embedded norms of culture, its primacy, they trump over anything else. You may have formal guarantee of equality, a constitutional guarantee. And yet, as you say, that India is an example that 70 some years later, after its constitution, embedded inequalities continue. And the definition of institution in this is institutions are humanly devised constraints to structure human interaction. So it is an informal institutions such as culture and family must they must speak to the formal laws and statutes. And that's how things start to change. But if there is a divorced reality between the two, then things do not change at the speed they ought to change. And that you see in many post-colonial contexts, where there's a big gap between cultural institutions and formal institutions. But that to say that is sort of more theoretical explanation, but in reality, I think empowerment-based strategies, I think since 2005, when the Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor came and came up with a new, I think the orthodoxy of only focus on the state sort of shifted, and focus people-centered strategies to empower people started. And there have been some fantastic examples, and maybe I'll let George ask us another question, and maybe I'll bring my example.
Okay. I wanted to make one or two observations, and one observation which I find very interesting, and it might be, in fact, one that can also be my final comment, is that I see our debate shifting between clashes between fixed and static cultural norms to becoming a much more pragmatic issue, an issue of, in fact, working with human rights in local context in a meaningful way, which is the local relevance of human rights challenge. And that is very much also what the next podcast, in fact, will examine. And so there's a good connection here. I would like to nevertheless pick up on another point that both of you have made, which is in various moments, how the issue of both universality, cultural differences, and so on is very often politicized, and sometimes even functions as a red flag in certain discussions. And we are living at a time of a certain backlash against the international human rights agenda, where I think these red flags, where the very human rights framework acts as a red flag, and there's this counter movement that's being launched against it. And I think the bottom up approaches you're very much advocating, as I take as hugely relevant, are one one path, one way of answering those challenges. But I think there also has to be an intellectual direct confrontation somehow with the high-level detractors of the global human rights agenda. What do you say to that?
So I think it is a very important question, and the Human Rights Project, is sort of 7 decades and plus old, the modern Universal Human Rights Project. And I think the world was a different place. The power balance when the project was conceived was skewed, so to say, in the world. And then from bipolar world we have come to a multipolar world, and highly, it's a very, I would say, a critical moment. I think when we say critical juncture in history, so fall of Berlin Wall gave us an opportunity to sort of, expand freedoms. But there is a slide back, as we can see. Backsliding is happening in the post-Berlin Wall world. Poland, Hungary, Russia are prominent examples of that. But even after that, now this is a world with contentious powers, sort of trying to gain control, ideological control. And I think for the international community, it's an important moment to bring everyone, liberal, not so liberal, illiberal, on the table and look at the Universal Human Rights Project. And maybe it needs rejigging. So I do think that not addressing issues of fundamental dignity, which will squarely come to economic rights issues, people living in precarity, people living in extreme deprivation in the 21st century. Pandemic has certainly laid bare the deprivation and inequities in the global context. So I think the issues of core dignities ought to be addressed fast and very fast. And although the SDG promises that by 2030 we would have eradicated extreme poverty and would have achieved those 400 odd goals, it is not realistic. So I think at the heart of, if we want to save, rejuvenate the Universal Human Rights Project, the issues of core dignity and core deprivations ought to be addressed. They have to be prioritized. Theoretically, we can say rights are indivisible, integral, they all need to be realized at the same time, but I would argue that certain core needs and ought to be addressed across the board in order for people to have faith in the project that, yes, rights are for all, dignity belongs to us, and justice is inclusive.
I think I agree with you that we need both ends if we want a rights framework to exist in our society. The bottom up is a non-option, but the demand for leadership at the top, the intellectual leadership, the political leadership, I think is the most difficult part. I find it very easy to have conversation on the ground because people tell you about human rights more than you tell them. But when on the top, the political leaders shy away because human rights have been politicized as a power tool when it is useful, when it is best for them. So it's the calculation of staying in power and winning votes. And I'm talking here in Malaysia and some countries around here. The more difficult issues, demands for equality, no to child marriage, everybody agrees with you intellectually, quietly, but they will not say it out because that may not get them the support they need. Speaking about how do we incentivize human rights as a political mileage? I think I'm still asking that question. I would have thought that the smartest of people would have used that to say, come on, this is for all, let's get equality, no racism. But obviously it's the converse. It's about this is for the majority, this religion, let's support and we will get more votes. And then I realized that fear can translate as growing anti-human rights sentiments. And I give an example just in 2018, after the big change of government in Malaysia after 60 years, a new fresh government came in. The losing parties organized themselves for an anti-ICED, the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Malaysia has not ratified it, so there was discussion on ratifying. So this group organized 50,000 people on the streets to have an anti-ICED rally, and they told the people who came, this is dangerous for the centrality of Islam, and it's a majority Islamic country. You may lose the power of the royalty, all with a myth. But the common person who had never heard ICED was mouthing this, but politicians were on the stage. So it was used as a negative to counter human rights, which was, I think, a disservice. But to their benefit, they wanted to win more votes of the Malay majority. But also, reality is our present COVID difficult situation, the pandemic, has also forced rights conversation. To be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated, what's the rights framework? Do people be locked up, not allowed to be getting jobs? And so that is a very public conversation for the first time by the health minister and the government, never before. And I think framing that is not an easy answer, but I think that conversation itself is making the political leadership have a conversation on the ground. And also another example is Malaysia, as I was telling others today, that you voted for change through the proper procedures of election, but midway through, members of parliament hop and changes your whole meaning and weight of the vote, and a government collapses. So suddenly the conversation on anti-hopping law, that politicians cannot hop because they need to respect that right to vote of the voter. So conversations start coming in a positive light, and politicians now start speaking. I'm saying this because I think there is a way to incentivize our political leadership that human rights actually is winnable for votes and for the people, because people want more rights than less.
I just want to say that since we had this conversation about culture and Western and non-Western culture, and is there a clash? And as I was thinking about this conversation, I thought of Ubuntu, the African philosophy of that humanity is interconnected. And that rooted concept of Ubuntu informs the work of the South African Constitutional Court, which has one of the most, they interpret one of the most progressive constitution. And many of their judgments on socioeconomic rights beautifully integrates Ubuntu and universal human rights principles. So often we don't hear about these close connection to traditional philosophies and universal principles. And in fact, the Universal Human Rights Project ultimately was informed by a struggle from below, from all over the world. So often we try to particularly politicize the debates, and when human rights are weaponized for the advancement of political agendas, populist political agenda, the focus is on somehow divisive and highlighting differences. But I think there is more in common among human societies. And I think that needs to be explored. And I think, therefore, the project to ensure that each individual lives with dignity, and there we have failed, I think, collectively here. So I am equally responsible, and in my small way, I try to address that issue, is like how to advance that agenda as quickly as possible.
Just a final word, George and Nandini. I think a part of this conversation of Western culture actually is a disservice to the Asian or African political leaders, because there is a notion that there is no rights embedded in our local communities. And that's totally false, because when I go to the ground, you meet people, they teach you more about rights, and you need to actually bring the UDHR or some conversation. I think the success of those documents are good writing skills and good English skills and putting it on paper, what was already on the ground. So I would always find it a bit insulting if any of my own political leaders is trying to say that Western rights are more troublesome. Then I will ask them, but aren't you saying that we have a better set of values than the so-called, if you are trying to assert Western rights? So I think even on those grounds, they lose the argument if you puncture holes in their so-called notions and point out that actually it is really a political ploy rather than a serious conversation on bringing rights for all. Thank you, George. Thanks, Nandini.
I thank you, Gerald, and Nandini as well. I think it's very interesting to me how the discussion has moved from the initial question of clashes between fixed cultural perceptions to a much more dynamic exploration of both the capacity of human rights in pragmatic terms, in empowering people to facilitate change from the bottom up, but also to address issues of global inequality, national, local, and global inequality. And I think and what's interesting to me is both listening to you, but also to anticipate that these are in fact two of the main themes in our coming episodes of this podcast series. And so there's a very beautiful connection, I think, between what you've set the stage, I think, for a further examination of some of these issues. And I really thank you for that as well.